The soil test report was dated September 14th, 1971. Walter Fenn had kept it in a manila folder in the farm office for 12 years before the drought of 1983 proved every number on it correct in a way that no one who had watched him farm that decade could easily dismiss. He had paid $18 for the test. He had sent soil samples from 11 different locations across his 320 acres in Jasper County, Indiana, following a grid pattern the county extension agent had described in a pamphlet, and the university lab had returned 11 separate analyses. The report was 4 pages. Most of it was numbers and tables. Walter had read it slowly over 2 evenings with a pencil and a notepad, and what he had found in those numbers had changed the way he farmed for the next 12 years. The number that changed everything was CEC. To understand what CEC is and why it mattered on Walter Fenn's farm, you have to understand something about how soil actually works that most farmers in Jasper County in 1971 had not been taught and had no particular reason to know. The Extension Office promoted fertilizer applications. The fertilizer dealers promoted fertilizer applications. The USDA recommendations promoted fertilizer applications. The entire economic and advisory structure of American agriculture in the early 1970s was oriented toward maximizing inputs because maximizing inputs had been, through most of the post-war period, the pathway to maximizing yields. The question of whether a given soil could actually use the fertilizer that was being applied to it, whether the fertilizer would stay in the root zone long enough to matter, was not a question that anyone was asking out loud. Cation exchange capacity is the measure of a soil's ability to hold positively charged nutrients. The most important agricultural nutrients, calcium, magnesium, potassium, and ammonium nitrogen, are all cations, positively charged ions that bind to the negatively charged particles in soil. Clay particles and organic matter are the primary carriers of that negative charge. A soil with high clay content and adequate organic matter has high CEC. It holds nutrients tightly, releases them slowly to plant roots, and retains them through rain events rather than losing them to leaching and runoff. A soil with low clay content and low organic matter, a sandy or coarse-textured soil, has low CEC. Nutrients applied to it have less to bind to. They move with water, they leach below the root zone, they run off in heavy rain, they are not available to the crop by the time the crop needs them, regardless of how much was applied. This is the asymmetry that the conventional fertilizer recommendation did not account for. A blanket recommendation of 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre assumed that the soil could hold 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Some soils could, some soils could not. For the soils that could not, the excess was not wasted in the sense of being lost permanently from the farming operation. It was wasted in the sense of not producing yield while still costing money. Walter Fenn's soil test report showed that his 320 acres were not uniform. They varied. The heavy black ground in the central and southern portions of his farm, the ground that had been wet in spring and slow to warm but consistently productive when it did warm, had CEC values ranging from 18 to 24 milliequivalents per 100 grams. That was genuinely high. That ground could hold a substantial nutrient load across seasons, bank it against the plant's future needs, and retain moisture through dry periods, because the same clay particles that held nutrients also held water. The lighter ground along the northern edge of the farm, sandier, better drained, faster to warm in spring and faster to dry out in summer, had CEC values of 8 to 12. That was low to moderate. That ground could hold perhaps a season's worth of carefully applied nutrients and not much more. Anything beyond that was going somewhere else. Walter wrote the CEC values on a map of his fields in pencil, 11 data points across 320 acres, and looked at the pattern. The northern quarter was low. The central and southern 3/4 were high. He had been farming all of it the same way, applying the same rates across the whole operation, because that was how fertilizer was applied and there was no system in place for doing it differently. Here's what Walter understood from those 11 numbers, and it took him 2 evenings and several pages of notes to work it out fully. The high CEC ground did not need the full recommended application every year. It was already holding nutrients from previous applications. It had a bank. The bank was being constantly refilled at rates that exceeded what the crop could draw down in a season. Some of what he was applying every spring was going into a pool that was already full. The low CEC ground, on the other hand, needed to be fed differently, not necessarily more, but more precisely, with nutrients applied in forms and at times when they could be captured by the root system before the soil lost them. Applying a full blanket rate of potassium to sandy ground in the fall was, he calculated, roughly equivalent to filling a leaky bucket and leaving it outside all winter. By spring, a significant portion had moved below the root zone. He wrote his revised application strategy on a legal pad in October 1971. High CEC ground. Reduce annual nitrogen application by 25%. Eliminate fall potassium, shift to spring-applied nitrogen in split doses to match plant uptake timing. Low CEC ground. Reduce total application rate. Apply more frequently in smaller doses. Focus on phosphorus, which moves more slowly than nitrogen. Across the full 320 acres, his revised fertilizer budget was approximately $2,400 less than the previous year's application. He kept the soil test report in the manila folder. He put it on the desk where he could find it. The coffee shop in Rensselaer that fall ran the way it always ran. A table of Jasper County corn farmers drinking coffee and discussing the coming season and the markets and the price of anhydrous and who had bought what equipment. Walter mentioned once that he had gotten a detailed soil test done and was going to adjust his application rates based on what the test showed about the variation across his fields. He explained briefly the difference between his high CEC and low CEC ground and what he intended to do differently on each. A man named Clifton Brody, who farmed 480 acres east of town and had been using the same fertilizer program for 15 years on the recommendation of his dealer, listened to this and said that if Walter was cutting his inputs, he could expect to cut his yields proportionally. He said the university had done the research on optimal application rates, and those rates existed for a reason. He said a man who underinvested in his fields in the short run would find out what it cost him in the yield numbers. He said it with the authority of someone who had not been surprised by a harvest number in 15 years and did not intend to start. Someone else at the table said that Walter's sandy ground up north was always going to pull the average down, and that maybe the soil test was just telling him what anybody could have told him by walking the fields, that the North Quarter wasn't worth pushing. Walter said that was part of what he'd learned from the test, yes. He did not say the other part, which was that the high ground in the center and south was being managed at rates that exceeded its capacity and that the excess was not turning into yield. That was the part that would take several seasons to demonstrate, and the coffee shop was not the place to demonstrate it. He did not argue with Clifton Brody. He had not argued with anyone. He had done his arithmetic on 11 data points and reached a conclusion he was prepared to test over several seasons, and he had no interest in defending it before the results were in. The results were not immediately dramatic. That was the first important thing to understand about a 12-year experiment. The high CEC ground continued to yield well under the reduced application program because the bank Walter had been overfilling for years provided nutrients in the first 2 seasons after he reduced inputs. His yields on the central and southern ground came in within 5% of the previous 3-year average. His fertilizer cost on those acres was $14 lower per acre, not $14 lower on every acre, but $14 lower on the roughly 240 acres of high CEC ground where he had made the biggest changes. That was $3,360 per year in input savings on the high CEC portion alone. The low CEC northern ground told a different story. Under the revised program, applying smaller amounts more precisely at the times the plant could capture them, his yields on that ground actually improved slightly in the first 2 seasons, not because he was putting more in, but because more of what he was putting in was being used. He was spending less and getting more because he had stopped filling the leaky bucket in fall and switched to filling it in spring when the bucket had been repaired by the root activity of the growing season. Here's how the mathematics of the decision accumulated over time, which is the part that the coffee shop never saw because it took place in a ledger rather than in a conversation. The first two seasons under the revised program, 1972 and 1973, did not produce the yield reduction that Clifton Brody had predicted. Walter's yields on the high CEC ground came in within 4% of his three-year prior average. The fertilizer cost savings were real, $3,200 in 1972, $3,600 in 1973. He recorded both in his ledger without announcing them. The low CEC northern quarter showed a modest yield improvement in 1973 on the revised program, 74 bushels compared to 68 the year before, because the spring-applied nitrogen was reaching the crop at the right time instead of leaching away over the winter. By 1975, the pattern was clear enough in Walter's ledger to calculate with confidence. He was spending less and yielding comparably on the high CEC ground, and yielding slightly better on the low CEC ground at lower cost. His net margin on the corn operation was improving, not because the yield was higher, it was not dramatically higher, but because the input cost was consistently lower. He soil tested again in 1975. The report showed that the high CEC ground had maintained its nutrient levels within normal ranges, despite the reduced annual applications. The bank was being drawn on, but not overdrafted. The nutrient levels in the soil were stable and available. The management theory was working. In 1977, corn prices spiked following the Soviet grain deal's effects on the global market and several years of strong export demand. And most Jasper County farmers responded by pushing their application rates higher to chase maximum yield. Clifton Brody told the coffee shop he was putting on 140 pounds of nitrogen per acre on his best ground, because at $3 corn, the return on every additional bushel justified the input cost. Walter held his application rates at the levels his soil tests had established. His yield in 1977 was 118 bushels per acre on the high CEC ground. Brody's was 124. The 6-bushel difference at $3 was $18 per acre. Brody spent approximately $8 more per acre in inputs to get there. His net advantage was $10 per acre. In a boom year with prices high enough to make maximum inputs pay, the aggressive strategy was marginally correct. Walter noted this in his ledger without changing his approach. He understood that in high-price years, the economics of pushing maximum inputs improved. He also understood that high-price years were not every year, and that the soil he was building maintained its capacity regardless of what corn was trading at, and that he was accumulating savings in the average and below average years that more than offset the marginal underperformance in the boom years. He was right about the averages. From 1972 through 1982, Walter Fenn averaged approximately $12 per acre, less in fertilizer costs than the county average for a comparable corn operation. On 320 acres, that was $3,840 per year. Over 11 years, it was $42,240. That was not all pure savings. Some of it was reinvested in more precise application equipment and in soil testing that he repeated every 4 years to track how the nutrient levels were changing. But after those costs, his net input saving over the period was approximately $31,000. He had also been building something in the soil that did not appear in any annual balance sheet. The high CEC ground, managed at nutrient levels that matched its holding capacity rather than exceeding it, had maintained its structure and its water-holding properties through the decade. It had not been depleted by excess applications that drove soil pH in directions that stressed microbial activity. It had not been compacted by the additional equipment passes that a more intensive application program would have required. The soil in 1982 was in better condition than the soil in 1971 in ways that a soil test could measure and that Walter understood, but that were not visible from the road or from a coffee shop table. The summer of 1983 arrived in Jasper County, Indiana, the way that drought summers arrive, not as a single event, but as a series of conditions that individually seem manageable and collectively become something else. April was dry. May was dry. June brought 2 inches of rain that should have been 4, and the crop came out of the ground without the moisture reserve that a good planting season would have left in the profile. July delivered 10 consecutive days above 95 degrees at the critical pollination period for corn, which is the week that determines whether the ear fills or doesn't, and those days had less than a quarter inch of rain between them. The county extension agent, a careful man who had been in Jasper County for 11 years and had seen difficult summers before, drove his routes in the second week of July and watched the corn. On the sandy, lighter ground throughout the county, the plants were beginning to roll, leaves curling inward on themselves to reduce transpiration surface, the plant's physiological response to water stress. Rolling during pollination was the kind of stress that cost yield. Rolling during pollination on sandy ground in a county where most farmers had managed their soils for maximum annual yield, rather than for soil structure and water holding capacity, was the kind of stress that cost a lot of yield. He drove past Walter Fenn's fields in the central and southern portion of his farm on a Thursday in the third week of July. The crop was not rolling, it was under stress. Every crop in the county was under stress that summer, but the high CEC clay-based soil was drawing on reserves that the lighter ground around it had already exhausted. The extension agent pulled over and looked for a long moment. Then he drove on. By the first week of August, the county extension agent was driving the roads and making notes that were going to be difficult to deliver. The corn was stressed across the county in ways that varied by field and by soil type, and the variation was telling a story about soil that most people had not been following for 12 years. Walter's yield on the high CEC central and southern ground came in at 94 bushels per acre. The county average for the 1983 season in Jasper County was 67 bushels per acre. The difference between those two numbers, 27 bushels per acre, on the 220 acres of high CEC ground, where Walter had been managing for 12 years, was 5,940 bushels. At the fall elevator price of $3.40 per bushel, that was $20,196 in additional gross revenue compared to a farmer producing at the county average on the same acreage. Here's what the 27 bushel difference actually represented in physical terms, because the mechanism is worth understanding precisely. The high CEC clay-based soils in Walter's central and southern fields had water-holding capacities of approximately 2.2 inches of available water per foot of soil depth. His top 3 feet of profile, where the majority of corn roots operate during stress periods, could hold roughly 6.5 inches of plant-available water. The low CEC sandy ground on his northern quarter held perhaps 3.8 inches across the same depth. During the July stress period, when rainfall was below half an inch for 10 consecutive days, and temperatures were pushing evapotranspiration demand above 0.35 inches per day, both soil types were drawing down their reserves. The high CEC ground, starting from a fuller profile because it had been managed at appropriate nutrient levels that maintained soil aggregation and water infiltration, lasted longer into the stress period without the corn entering severe wilt stress during pollination. The difference between mild stress and severe stress at pollination can be 20 to 40 bushels per acre on Indiana ground in a year like 1983. Walter's numbers were in the middle of that range. The northern quarter came in at 54 bushels per acre. That ground had always been his lower yielding zone, and the drought had not changed that relationship. He had known since 1971 what that ground was and had managed it accordingly, not trying to make it produce like the southern ground, but managing it at a cost structure that made it worth farming even when it yielded below average. Clifton Brody averaged 61 bushels per acre across his 480-acre operation in 1983. He had spent approximately $19 per acre more in fertilizer inputs than Walter had for the previous decade, and had produced at roughly county average in normal years, and meaningfully below county average in the drought year that revealed the difference in soil structure. He had not been farming badly. He was a competent, experienced farmer who had followed the agronomic recommendations that the university and his dealer had provided. He had not been told that those recommendations did not account for the CEC variation within his own operation, and he had never had his soil tested at the resolution that would have shown him the variation. His 1983 yield was 17 bushels per acre below county average on his worst ground. The combination of higher input costs over 11 years and lower yield in the drought year, the year when yield differences were most expensive, given the tight margins already operating across the county. Put his 10-year net position relative to Walter's at a gap that neither of them had ever calculated directly, but that Walter could have produced if asked. He had the ledger. He did not produce it in the coffee shop. That was not his way. He had not gone into the coffee shop in the fall of 1983 saying that the drought had proved him right. He was not that kind of man. He talked about the yield numbers the way farmers talk about yield numbers, as facts, not as arguments. And he filed the 1983 soil test report alongside the 1971 one in the manila folder and went back to work. Clifton Brody had not been farming badly. He had been farming without the information that an $18 soil test in 1971 would have given him. The coffee shop that fall was a different conversation than the one a decade earlier. People were comparing yields and comparing inputs, and some of them were beginning to ask questions they had not asked before about why the variation across the county was as large as it was. Walter had his answers ready. He had been carrying them in a manila folder for 12 years. If the way these soil stories are useful to you, if understanding the mechanism behind a yield difference rather than just the number helps you think about your own ground, this channel does exactly this work every week. There are more stories like this one, about decisions made years before the season that proved them, about the arithmetic that sits underneath the surface of a farm and determines the outcomes that everybody talks about after the fact. Subscribe and we'll keep them coming. Walter Fenn farmed that Jasper County ground until 1998, when he transferred the operation to his son-in-law, who had been farming alongside him for 7 years. Before the transfer, Walter had the soil tested one more time. The report came back showing CEC values across the high-quality ground that had climbed from a 1971 average of 21 to a 1997 average of 23. The organic matter in those fields had increased by 0.4 percentage points over the same period. The soil in 1997 was measurably better than the soil Walter had started with, and the management decisions that had made it better had also saved him $31,000 in fertilizer costs over the intervening years, and had produced 5,940 extra bushels in a drought year that had tested every acre of ground in the county. He showed his son-in-law the 1971 soil test report and the 1997 soil test report side by side. The numbers moved in the right direction on every line. He said, "This is what 12 years of correct management looks like in a piece of paper. It's slow. It doesn't show up in the yield numbers until the bad years. But in the bad years, it shows up in exactly the right place." His son-in-law filed both reports in the same manila folder.